some of the background issues in the Galileo controversy. And I'm going to be drawing on Maurice Finocchiaro's The Trial of Galileo, Essential Documents, as well as some other resources, just to talk about that. So first of all, Finocchiaro writes that, in a sense, there are two sets of intellectual issues at work here in the controversy. And he himself is drawing on Owen Gingerich. And the first is the scientific issue. Okay, there's two different scientific models. The big scientific question between Galileo and his critics, which is not just the Catholic Church authorities, the clergy of the church, but indeed professors of natural philosophy at the universities and everything. So it's a debate among intellectuals and not simply Galileo versus the Pope or something like that. And so on the one hand, Galileo is saying that the Earth goes around the sun, and the opponents of Galileo are saying that he's wrong to challenge the consensus that the sun and everything else goes around the Earth. That's the key scientific issue. And as hopefully you can see from lesson 1.3, the established science, in a sense, the established natural philosophy was that our senses, that we could see, we could see that it was true that Aristotle, Ptolemy established astronomy, and the Bible and the Christian tradition all pointed to the idea that the Earth was at the center, the sun and the stars and the planets all went around us. Okay, so it wasn't that it was just Galileo versus dumb people. It was that Galileo was challenging the established intellectual consensus that had a long tradition going for it. Okay, so that's the main scientific issue. Okay, that should be, of course, fairly clear. But then behind that, there are what you can call methodological or epistemological issues. In other words, how would we know? And that's helpful to think about because if you ask me, how do I know that the Earth goes around the sun? Well, I learned it in science class and by reading history and things like that. But I've never seen it happen. I haven't done the requisite scientific experiments or made the observations. So how does anybody know? And Finocchiaro says that there are four big methodological, epistemological issues here. The first is, can something be true if we can't actually sense it in any way? Nobody in this period saw the Earth going around the sun. Instead, Galileo and others believed that the available evidence was best explained by a theory of the Earth going around the sun. Okay, that you couldn't explain the moons of Jupiter in the old model. That, like Copernicus and others, the putting the sun at the center of the solar system took a lot of the complications out of explaining how things appeared to move. It was a simpler model. It explained things better, okay? But nobody could see it happening. And so could something be true for that reason, even if your senses didn't perceive it? Okay, that's one issue. The second is, what role does something like the telescope play in it, in understanding the truth about the universe? The telescope was the first sort of technology used to, in a sense, extend the senses. So it was an instrument that was used. The first technology that was used in science like that. Of course, there are other tools and everything used, but this is the first one used to try to understand the universe in this way. And so are the observations that Galileo has made with the telescope equal to the kind of evidence that you get from just using your senses? Okay. And that might seem like a strange question for us, but this is a brand new technology, really. In the early 1600s is when it's really starting to be used even by sailors and everything. So it's a pretty new technology, and even in the sciences too. The third issue is the role of the Bible. What role should the Bible play in setting the boundaries for how we understand the universe? Okay, and so Galileo is saying that in the letter to Benedetto Castelli and to the Grand Duchess Christina, that the Bible is talking about salvation. The Bible is talking about revealing the path that God has shown to redemption. But it's not describing the world and the universe, the physical reality, literally. That's not the purpose of it. Okay, and so Galileo says, really, you should leave the Bible to one side when you're trying to understand the universe. And if the universe and the scientific laws and theories that you're able to derive from observation go along with the Bible, that's great. But really, the Bible is not talking about that, and just uses common people's understanding so that it doesn't confuse them. Okay, so it's a pretty minimalistic view of the Bible's accuracy, literal accuracy about the physical world. Now, Galileo never says that the Bible is wrong. He's very careful to say the Bible is not wrong. It's just that it's using metaphors, it's using common people's understanding about the world so that they can understand it. On the other hand, his critics are saying, well, Galileo, you're saying the Bible is wrong, right? You're against the Bible. You are ignoring the Bible, and you're ignoring the whole tradition of interpretation of the Bible from the church fathers have and everything too. So the commenters on the Bible in the history of the Christian church have also taken it literally on things like the earth being at the center of the universe, and Galileo's going against that. And that's going to be a big deal for Galileo, and he tries very hard in the letter to Benedetto Castelli and the letter to the Grand Duchess Christina to say, no, I'm not against the Bible. I'm only saying that some of the people who have tried to explain what the Bible says have been wrong. Okay. The fourth issue of methodology and epistemology is hypotheses. Okay, a hypothesis, right, is a suggestion about how the world might work that can be tested by evidence. And the disagreement here is, does a hypothesis have to be taken as true or not? Galileo is saying, especially in the early part of his career, that not only does Copernicus's explanation of the universe or of the solar system as going around the sun, not only is that a useful hypothesis, but it's actually describing reality. His opponents, on the other hand, have said, and the church authorities had said too, Copernicus's system is useful for helping us, with the understanding where the position of the stars are going to be. It's a good model for predicting. It's not describing reality, but it can be useful for contradicting things. So in that case, the hypothesis could be something that could be useful but not true. And so that's another issue that's going on here with Galileo and his opponents. Okay, and indeed Galileo has to kind of adopt that last position of his opponents, that the sun-centered solar system is a useful hypothesis. In his book, The Dialogue Concerning the Two World Systems, that he gets in trouble for in the 1630s. Now, those are the main issues of the intellectual issues at stake. Okay, but there are also other issues at stake too. This is not just a battle between rival intellectual models. Okay, that's rarely how it works in intellectual disputes. There's also personalities at play. Galileo is someone who's involved in a lot of controversies. He seems to be extremely self-confident, sometimes very harshly critical of others, and he does make some intellectual enemies. There's also rivalries between different religious orders, as much as we might think of the Catholic Church as a big monolith. Even back then, it's not. Instead, it has rival religious orders like Jesuits and Dominicans, and it's got different church offices like the Holy Office or the Inquisition, different parts of the church bureaucracy. It's not one monolithic, unified set of clergymen. Okay, so that plays a role. There's also the religious and political context too. Okay, one thing that Galileo, in which Galileo really rubs the church the wrong way, is that he goes from saying, that that the evidence suggests it supports what he's saying, to also saying, that the Bible is not meant to tell people about the universe. And that might seem uncontroversial or kind of strange to cause a controversy, but it's probably important to keep in mind that he's telling the church how to interpret the Bible, and saying that the early church fathers got it wrong on the issue of the earth being at the center of the universe. And it's helpful to remember that the papacy and the church and its bishops as a whole claim the authority to interpret the Bible in an authoritative way. So when Galileo is saying, actually, this is the way you should interpret the Bible, that's not going to be taken well, okay? Because he's telling the church how to interpret the Bible. And you may know from this period, there's another group of people doing that, or many groups of people doing that, and they were called Protestants. And that was an issue of some dispute, obviously. The church had become split between different groups, and the Protestants had said, one of the main reasons that they were in such disagreement with the Catholic, with the papacy, was that they said the church has very badly misinterpreted the Bible. Okay? And one more aspect of all that is that when Galileo really gets in trouble in the 1630s with the church, in his worst state of things here, it's during the 30 Years' War. His initial trial was just before the 30 Years' War, but the big trial was, initial investigation, I should say, not trial, in 1615 and 1616 was before the 30 Years' War. In the 30 Years' War, which is this catastrophic, devastating war that takes place, and has a lot of Protestant-Catholic rivalries at stake, the papacy, and I described this a little bit more in the documents down below, but the papacy is being criticized for not declaring the 30 Years' War a holy war, for being too friendly to the French. And the French were kind of fighting on the Protestant side, if you can call it that. The Spanish and the Holy Roman Imperial forces were very upset with or the rulers were very upset with the papacy. And you have to remember that the Pope was not only the ruler of the church, but also a king in a sense too. He was a king who ruled a territory, the Papal States in central Italy. And so they were upset with the papacy for not throwing himself fully on the Spanish and imperial side, the side of the Holy Roman Empire, and in a sense, aiding the Protestants with his inaction. Okay, you can read a little bit more about that in the document below. Okay, so there's a lot going on here besides just two clashing views about the nature of the universe.